Imagine living a life where every smile hides a secret, every moment is a battle, and the only escape is to disappear completely. Are you ready to uncover the story of a woman who faked her death to reclaim her freedom? I remember the smell of wet earth before I remember the faces. The rain had stopped minutes before the ceremony began, leaving behind a heavy mist that curled around the gravestones like ghosts reluctant to leave. I stood behind an old oak tree, my coat soaked, my hands trembling inside my pockets. I could see my casket lowered into the ground, a handful of dirt hitting the lid with a hollow, final sound. They thought I was dead. Every single one of them. My husband, the pastor, even my own sister, who stood there crying as if she'd lost me forever. And in a way, she had. The wind carried their murmurs across the cemetery. Poor Margaret, someone said. Such a tragedy. I wanted to scream that it wasn't a tragedy, it was my freedom. The only way out. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt, like it was trying to break through my chest and confess everything. I watched as the man who once swore to love me placed a single white rose on the coffin. His lips tightened, his eyes dry. That was the moment I knew he wasn't mourning me. He was relieved. I had spent 20 years in that house, behind those blue shutters that looked peaceful from the outside, but hid a war inside. We lived in a small town in Georgia, one of those places where the air smelled of magnolia trees. And gossip traveled faster than light. Everyone believed John Miller was a devoted husband, a church deacon, a man of God. They didn't see the way his hand could turn from gentle to cruel in seconds, or how he could twist scripture into shackles that bound me tighter than any chain. A wife must submit, he'd whisper before slamming the door, leaving me in the dark with bruises that bloomed like violets on my skin. The night I decided to die, or at least make them believe I wasn't born out of courage. It was born out of fear. He had found the letter from my sister, the one where she begged me to leave him, to come stay with her in Nashville. I still remember the sound of his footsteps on the porch, slow and deliberate, before he entered the room. "You think you can leave me, Maggie," he said softly, almost kindly, and that terrified me more than his anger ever did. That night, I slept with a packed suitcase under the bed and a knife inside the pillowcase, just in case he came for me. For weeks, I planned my death as carefully as he planned his sermons. Every small detail mattered: the broken bridge near the river, the current strong enough to carry away a car, the way the neighbors never looked twice when someone drove out late at night. I found an old wreck at a junkyard, same make and color as my own. I paid the owner $200 in cash money I'd hidden from grocery change over the years and told him to tow it near the riverbank after midnight. He didn't ask questions. In a town like ours, people pretended not to see what didn't concern them. The night it happened, I left the house barefoot, wearing his old raincoat. The rain was heavy, the kind that drowned out everything. My hands shook as I poured gasoline over the wrecked car, lit a match, and threw it into the open window. The fire roared to life, orange and violent against the black sky. I left my wedding ring on the driver's seat. It melted fast. I watched until the flames reached the trees, then I walked away, no plan, no map, just the sound of my heartbeat guiding me through the dark. Now, standing there in that cemetery, watching my husband whisper a prayer over an empty shell of metal and ash they believed was me, I felt something close to peace. But it was fragile, trembling at the edges of guilt. Because as much as I wanted to disappear, part of me still wanted to be seen, wanted someone to know the truth, that I hadn't died, that I had finally saved myself. And then, through the fog, I saw her, my sister, Evelyn. She looked smaller than I remembered, older too. Her hands clutched a damp handkerchief, her eyes red. When she stepped closer to the grave, something inside me cracked open. I wanted to run to her, to tell her I was alive, to feel her arms again. But I couldn't. One glimpse, one word, and everything would fall apart. So I turned away and let her bury me. As the first shovelfuls of dirt hit the coffin, I whispered into the wind, Goodbye, Margaret Miller. It was both a farewell and a birth. The woman they buried that day was gone. The one who walked away from that cemetery didn't have a name yet, but she was free. Before I became a ghost, before the lies and the funeral and the ashes, I was just Margaret Fields, a 20-year-old girl who believed that love could fix everything. It was 1958, and the world felt like it was changing for everyone but me. I met John at a church picnic in Savannah, under a white tent that smelled of fried chicken and fresh-cut grass. He was charming, then handsome, in a clean, pressed shirt, his Bible always tucked neatly under one arm. He said I had the kind of smile that made a man want to do better, and I believed him. God help me, I believed every word. Our courtship was quick, almost rushed. My father was dying of lung cancer, and John became the man who carried him to bed, who read him scripture in the evenings. My mother adored him, saying I was blessed to have found a man so dedicated to faith and family. When we married that December, the church bells rang, and the entire congregation watched us like we were the promise of something pure. I remember thinking, if this is what forever looks like, I can live with it. The first time he hit me was 3 months later. It was a Thursday. Supper was late. I'd burned the cornbread because the baby, our first, little Samuel, had been crying non-stop with colic. John came home from the lumberyard tired, silent, the kind of silence that filled every corner of the room like a slow-moving storm. When I tried to apologize, he didn't shout. He didn't curse. He just raised his hand, almost casually, and the back of it caught my cheek. I remember the sound more than the pain, a sharp, dry crack that didn't feel real at first. He looked at me, eyes blank, and said, "You need to learn, Maggie. The Lord disciplines those he loves." I told myself it was an accident, that he was under pressure, that it wouldn't happen again. And when he came home the next day with a bouquet of wildflowers and a soft voice, I forgave him, because that's what good wives did. That's what my mother would have told me to do. But forgiveness became a ritual, one that repeated itself after every bruise, every broken plate, every whispered prayer I said through a split lip. Years blurred together like a long, grey winter. By 1965, we had 2 children, Samuel and Ruth, and a house that looked picture perfect from the outside. John had been promoted to foreman at the mill. On Sundays, he preached to the congregation about love, respect, and the sanctity of marriage. The same hand that struck me would rest on my shoulder in church, gentle and steady, while he spoke of God's mercy. People would smile at us. They'd call us an inspiration. And I would smile back, the way you do when your survival depends on it. He began to control everything: the groceries I bought, the friends I spoke to, the letters I wrote. He even dictated what colors I could wear. No reds, he'd say, to Proud. Once, when I spent 50 cents without telling him, he locked me in the pantry for an entire night, saying I needed time to reflect. I remember sitting there in the dark, listening to my children sleep in the next room, wondering when my reflection had turned into a stranger. But the worst part wasn't the violence. It was the manipulation. He knew how to twist kindness into chains. He'd read me verses about obedience, about how we've brought sin into the world, about how my suffering was a test. Every woman must carry her cross, he'd whisper, and I'd bite my lip until I tasted blood, trying not to cry, because crying only made things worse. In 1969, my mother came to visit. She was older, frailer, but she saw through the cracks in my smile. One night, after John had gone to bed, she held my face in her hands and said softly, "He's killing you, Maggie." Maybe not with his fists, but piece by piece. I wanted to tell her she was wrong. I wanted to tell her that I could fix him, that our love was stronger than this. But I couldn't speak, because deep down, I knew she was right. When she died 2 months later, I didn't cry at the funeral. Not because I wasn't grieving, but because John didn't allow me to. "People will think you're hysterical," he said. gripping my wrist so tightly I felt the bones grind. I stood there in that church, numb, while the preacher read the same verses John used to justify everything he did to me. That was the moment I began to see him not as my husband, but as my warden. The house grew colder after that. He started locking away money, keeping the car keys hidden. He told me that if I ever left, he'd take the children, that no court would believe a woman like me. "You're nothing without me," he'd say. And for a long time, I believed him. Until Evelyn, my sister, wrote that letter. The one that changed everything. It arrived folded inside a birthday card. Just 3 lines written in her slanted handwriting. "You don't have to die there, Maggie. Come to me. I'll help you." I read it over and over until the paper tore where my fingers had been. That night, I hid the letter inside my Bible. I didn't know then that it would be the reason I'd have to bury my name forever. The night I decided to ask him for permission to visit my sister was the same night the cicadas started screaming outside our window, their sound sharp and endless like the thoughts in my head. It was the summer of 1970, and Savannah felt like a furnace, humid, heavy, air thick with the smell of salt and decay. The kind of heat that makes even the angels sweat. I'd spent the whole day rehearsing what I would say, knowing that every word could be a spark that set him off. "It's just a visit," I told myself, "just a few days to see Evelyn." But even as I said it in my head, I knew how it sounded, like a plea for freedom. He was sitting in his usual spot, the armchair near the radio, reading the paper as if the world beyond our walls didn't exist. The children were asleep, their soft breathing the only rhythm I could cling to. I stood in the doorway, hands clasped in front of me, and said, "John, Evelyn wrote me. She's not been well. I'd like to go see her just for a few days." My voice trembled at the edges, fragile, betraying the terror under my ribs. He didn't look up right away, just folded the newspaper slowly, deliberately, the sound of the pages tearing the silence apart. When his eyes finally met mine, they were com. "And who attend to your duties here, Maggie?" he asked, voice low, almost kind. "Who would look after the children, cook their meals, keep this home?" He leaned back, smiling faintly. "Your place is here. I could be back by Sunday," I whispered. "Evelyn's alone." His hand moved faster than I could think. The slap came so suddenly it felt like lightning, bright, hot, immediate. My head snapped sideways, the taste of copper flooding my mouth. He stood up then, towering over me, his breath sour with whiskey. "Don't you ever ask me to leave this house again," he said softly, almost tenderly. "You want to see your sister? Pray for her." He turned, walked away, and I heard the lock click behind him when he entered the bedroom. I slept on the kitchen floor that night, cheek pressed against the cool tile, eyes wide open. The ceiling fan spun above me like a slow, mechanical halo. For weeks, he watched me closer than ever. Every letter that came through the mail was opened first by him. Every trip to the market timed. He even began asking the neighbors what I did when he was away. I could feel the walls closing in. But Evelyn's words wouldn't leave me. "You don't have to die there, Maggie." One afternoon, while he was at the mill, I snuck into the attic and found the old trunk where he kept the savings envelope. There was a little over $200 inside, months of my quiet collecting, a few coins from grocery change here and there. It wasn't much, but it could buy a bus ticket to Charleston, where Evelyn lived. I wrapped the money in a handkerchief and hid it beneath a loose floorboard behind the wardrobe. My heart raced so fast I thought it might give me away. That evening, he came home earlier than usual. His face was calm, but his eyes were wild. "You been somewhere today?" he asked. "You look nervous." My hands shook as I poured him a drink. "Just the market," I said, forcing a smile. "The milk was spoiled." He watched me too long. Then he laughed, quiet, slow. "You're a terrible liar, Maggie." He didn't say anything else. But later that night, when I went to check on the children, the floorboard was gone. The handkerchief too. He woke me at dawn by pouring a glass of water over my face. You thought you could steal from me, he hissed. His hand gripped my throat not to choke, but to make me look at him. You think the world's waiting out there with open arms? You think your sister's gonna save you? She's no better than you. He threw the crumpled handkerchief at me and left for work, slamming the door so hard the glass in the window cracked. That was the first time I truly knew he would never let me leave alive. For days, I moved like a ghost through the house, numb, my body on autopilot while my mind screamed for escape. And then, as if the universe pitied me, something shifted. John had an accident at the Miller's small one, but enough to keep him bedridden for a week. I saw him there, helpless, the man who'd once terrified me reduced to a wounded animal. I felt no pity, only clarity. If I couldn't leave him, then I would have to die. Not really die, but vanish so completely that even he would believe I was gone. That was the impossible request I made to God that night as I sat in the kitchen with the lights off and the moonlight spilling through the window. Let me die without dying, I whispered. Let me bury her, the woman who belonged to him, and walk away as someone else. It was the first prayer I ever made that felt like it might actually save me. The idea came to me like a fever dream, half madness, half salvation. I was scrubbing the floor when it hit. I didn't need to run away. I needed to disappear. John had made it clear that leaving would mean death, so maybe death was exactly what I should give him. I remember standing there with the bucket of grey water, the mop in my hand trembling, my reflection rippling in the dirty puddle. What if I died and he saw it? What if he believed it? It was 1971, and in Savannah, people still believed what they saw in the local paper more than their own eyes. I'd read stories about women lost to the river, their bodies never recovered. The Savannah River swallowed secrets better than any confessional booth. That night, I lay awake listening to the soft groans of the house, the cicadas screaming again, and I began to piece it all together. I could do it. I could vanish. The next morning, I began collecting small things, quiet things. My old birth certificate, a locket Evelyn had given me years before, the house key, and the obituary section of the newspaper. Every item felt like a piece of a spell I was casting. I couldn't tell anyone, not even the children. The plan had to live and die with me. It started with a letter short, desperate, convincing. I wrote it in my own hand, but shaky, uneven, as if written in panic. I can't take this anymore. Tell my children I love them. Forgive me. I signed it with my full name and left it folded inside the Bible John kept on the mantel. The Bible he never opened, but everyone in town would see as proof of my devotion. Then came the river. The Savannah River was wide, brown, and cold even in the summer. I walked there one afternoon with a basket full of clothes, pretending to wash them like the other women did. When no one was watching, I dropped one of my old shoes into the current and watched it drift away, swallowed by the muddy water. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. That shoe was my test. If the river could take it without question, maybe it could take me. A week later, I prepared for the real thing. John had gone to a cousin's house in Augusta to recover, leaving me and the children home. I told our neighbor, Mrs. Lang, that I'd been feeling dizzy lately, fainting sometimes. You know, Maggie, she said, fanning herself, you work yourself to the bone. You ought to rest. I smiled weakly. Maybe I will, I said. She would remember that later. That night, I left the house barefoot, wearing only a pale blue nightgown and my shawl. The air was thick and warm, and the moon was so bright it painted the world silver. I walked the mile to the riverbank, carrying only a small satchel with the essentials, the locket, the cash I'd hidden again, a spare dress, and Evelyn's address. When I reached the bridge, I stood for a long time, staring down at the water that looked like melted glass. The reflection of the moon wavered with the ripples, as if daring me to jump. I didn't jump, but I made sure the world would think I had. I left the nightgown's torn sleeve caught on the railing and one shoe near the edge. Then I took the long way back to the woods, heart hammering, every sound a threat. By the time I reached the highway, my bare feet were bleeding and my throat burned with dust. I flagged down a truck heading east. The driver, a quiet man in his 40s, asked where I was headed. Charleston, I said. My voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. He nodded and opened the passenger door. By dawn, I was gone. The next day, the Savannah paper ran the headline, "Local woman presumed drowned in river accident." They used my name. My neighbors told the police I'd been unwell. The pastor read a passage from Psalms about finding peace in the waters of God. My children, I would later learn, cried themselves to sleep. And John wept too. Or so they said. But I didn't see that part. Because I was already in Charleston, standing outside Evelyn's boarding house with the world's quietest heartbeat and a name that no longer belonged to me. For the first time in my life, I felt the kind of silence that wasn't made of fear. For the first few weeks, I lived like a shadow, half alive, half memory. Evelyn took me in without asking questions, though I could see the worry in her eyes every time she looked at me. I told her I'd left John, that I just needed time. She didn't press, just nodded, saying, "You always were too brave for your own good." Her room above the bakery smelled like sugar and burnt crust, and for a while, I let that scent become my new beginning. I worked quietly, cleaning tables, wiping crumbs, pretending to be someone named Mary Allen. I used Evelyn's maiden name. It sounded simple, harmless, forgettable. Each morning, I'd braid my hair tight, tie it under a scarf, and remind myself that Margaret Hartley had died in the river. Mary Allen didn't look back, but the dead don't rest when the living keep calling their name. It started smaller headline in the Charleston Gazette. A man's photograph. My husband's face, beneath the words, "Local man seeks information about missing wife, possible foul play." The date read 2 weeks after my death. My hands shook so hard I nearly tore the paper in half. I read it again and again. He wasn't mourning. He was hunting. Evelyn found me sitting in the kitchen with the newspaper clutched to my chest. "He's looking," I whispered. "He doesn't believe I'm dead." She reached for my hand, her fingers cold and trembling. "Then we'll make him believe harder," she said. But there was something behind her voice, hesitation, guilt, maybe even fear. Days turned into weeks, and I began to sense that something wasn't right. Evelyn would disappear at odd hours, say she was visiting a friend, return pale and distracted. Once I caught her crying quietly in her room, holding a letter she refused to show me. The silence between us began to stretch and crack like ice. Then one night, I woke to the sound of voices downstairs. I crept down the narrow staircase, barefoot, careful not to let the wood creak. The light under the door flickered yellow and soft, like candlelight. I pressed my ear to the frame. Evelyn's voice, low, urgent. And then another voice, a man's. My blood froze. "I told you not to come here," Evelyn said, her voice shaking. "I had to," the man replied. "You think I don't know what you did?" I couldn't breathe. The tone, the sharp, deliberate way he spoke. It couldn't be him. John was back in Savannah. But when I peeked through the crack, I saw him. The same heavy shoulders, the same dark hair combed neatly back. My husband standing in Evelyn's kitchen like he'd always belonged there. I didn't scream. I didn't move. I just watched as Evelyn turned away from him, her hands gripping the counter. "She's gone," she said quietly. "You have to let her go." John stepped closer. "Don't lie to me, Evie. No one called her that but family." My mind spun. I remembered childhood summers, the way Evelyn would vanish for months to visit relatives, the letters she never showed me, the guilt in her eyes when I told her about John years ago. Suddenly, the pieces fell together in one horrifying click. Evelyn hadn't just known John. She was his sister. My world collapsed right there, in that dim little room above the bakery. All the kindness, the protection, the rescue, it had been built on a lie. I stumbled back, my hand over my mouth, trying not to make a sound. My pulse pounded in my ears so loud I thought they'd hear it. I backed up the stairs one trembling step at a time, heart breaking with every movement. When I finally reached my room, I locked the door and pressed my back against it. My body felt weightless, like it might float apart. I had died once already, but this felt like dying all over again. Evelyn, my savior. John, my ghost. They'd never stopped watching me. That night, I packed what little I had, a change of clothes, a loaf of bread, and my sister's photograph. I didn't wait for dawn. I didn't even write a note. I slipped out the back door and into the streets, leaving behind the one person who had helped me survive because she had also betrayed me. As the morning sun rose, I caught a bus heading north. I didn't know where it was going. I just knew it wasn't here. And for the second time in my life, I died. The bus took me as far as Richmond, Virginia. I remember stepping off at dawn, the air sharp with the smell of rain and exhaust, my hands trembling as I held the small paper bag with everything I owned. I was no longer Margaret Hartley, not even Mary Allen. I told myself names were just ghosts we carry. So I became Clara. Just Clara. A woman with no past. For months, I lived in a boarding house on the east side, where the wallpaper peeled like tired skin and the landlady called everyone sweetheart. I cleaned rooms at a roadside motel, changed sheets that reeked of strangers' perfume and cigarettes, and told myself every day that this anonymity was freedom. Sometimes at night, I'd wake up certain I heard footsteps outside my door. Sometimes I'd see a car parked across the street for hours, engine running. I told myself it was just paranoia. But every reflection in a window made my heart stop. Every man's laugh felt like a threat. I tried to build a life anyway. I learned to smile again, to speak to people without flinching. A woman at the diner named Ruth took to me quickly. She was loud, always laughing, her lipstick a little crooked. She'd slap my arm and say, "Clara, you've got eyes like someone who's seen too much." I'd just smile, because she was right. In the winter of 1958, she dragged me to a church Christmas supper. The place was warm and glowing, full of families and noise. I hadn't been near a church since my own funeral, and stepping inside felt like trespassing in a world that had forgotten me. But then I met Thomas. He was quiet, kind in a way that didn't demand anything. A widower who worked at the post office, always smelling faintly of coffee and paper. We started talking over cups of weak punch, and something about him, the way he listened without pity, made the world tilt back into color. For the first time in years, I thought maybe I could stop running. Thomas and I married that spring. Small ceremony, no photographs. I wore a pale blue dress I found in a second-hand shop and told him my parents had died young, that I had no family left. He never pressed for more. In his silence, I found peace. Years passed. We bought a small house near the edge of town. I planted a garden. I learned to bake again, to laugh without the sound breaking in my throat. Every so often, I'd look at Thomas across the table and think, maybe this is what rebirth feels like. But then, one morning in 1962, everything cracked again. Thomas came in from getting the mail, his expression tight. He placed a brown envelope on the table. "For you," he said. I frowned. No one ever wrote to me. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed neatly. "The dead shouldn't receive mail, Margaret," my breath caught. I stared at the words until they blurred. There was no signature, no return address. Just those 9 words that ripped the ground out from under me. Thomas's voice came from far away. "Clara." "What is it?" I couldn't answer. My chest burned, my vision tunneled. I stumbled out of the kitchen, clutching the letter like proof that my worst nightmare had followed me north. The air outside was heavy and hot, the world spinning. Who could have sent it? Evelyn. No, she wouldn't. She couldn't. Unless John had found her again. Unless he'd made her tell him everything. For the first time in years, I felt like a hunted animal again. That night, I packed a small suitcase and sat by the window, listening to the sound of the train in the distance. I thought about waking Thomas, telling him everything: the abuse, the river, the false death, the funeral, but the words lodged in my throat. If I told him, I'd make him a target too. She thought she had escaped, that the past was behind her, but what if the ghosts she ran from were still watching? Stay with us as we dive deeper into this harrowing journey of survival, lies, and the ultimate fight for freedom. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to follow the story to its shocking conclusion. So, when the first light of dawn touched the curtains, I kissed his forehead, whispered goodbye, and walked out the door. Again, 3 hours later, I was gone, a ghost slipping into the fog of another town. But this time, I swore to myself, if he found me again, I wouldn't run. I would finish what I started. I took a bus south again, though I can't tell you why. Maybe because fear has a strange gravity, it pulls you backward. Back to the beginning, to the places that hurt. I ended up in a small town outside Raleigh, renting a room above a laundromat. The air smelled like detergent and regret. Days blurred together. I took work wherever I could: cleaning, sewing, keeping books for a small tailor shop. But every time the doorbell rang, I'd flinch. Every time someone said my name, I'd wait for it to sound wrong, for someone to whisper Margaret. The letter never left my purse. I'd unfold it every night, run my thumb across the words, trying to read what wasn't there. The paper was clean, precise, too deliberate. Someone wanted me to know they'd been watching, but who? Weeks later, as I walked home through the market square, I saw a face that made my knees weaken. It was a woman, older, thinner, but her eyes were the same soft grey I'd memorized as a child. Evelyn. My sister. I followed her through the crowd, calling her name once, softly, like a prayer I wasn't ready to believe in. She turned, and when she saw me, her hand flew to her mouth. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then she whispered, trembling, "You're supposed to be dead. We found a quiet place behind the church, away from the world's ears." She clutched my hands, crying, "Maggie, they said you drowned. They buried an empty coffin. Mama never stopped believing you'd come back." I wanted to tell her everything: the fake death, the funeral, the years of hiding, but the words tangled inside me. Instead, I asked, "How did you find me?" Evelyn hesitated. "I didn't. Someone came to me last month. A man. Said he'd seen you. Said you'd be safer if I stayed quiet." My blood turned to ice. "What man?" She shook her head. "He never gave a name. But he knew everything, Maggie. About John. About the river. About that night." I felt the air leave my lungs. My hands were shaking so hard I had to press them to my chest. "He's dead, Evelyn. I saw him die." Her eyes filled with fear. "Then who buried him?" The question hung in the air like a ghost refusing to leave. I wanted to run, to scream, to tear the memory of his face from my mind. But deep down, I knew. I had never gone back to that riverbank. I had never checked. Evelyn begged me to come home with her, but home was a word that no longer meant safety. I stayed in town instead, restless, pacing, watching. Days later, a letter arrived under my door. No stamp. No handwriting. Just typed words again. "You didn't finish what you started, Margaret." I felt sick. The same paper. The same typewriter. And at the bottom, in faint pencil, "You never even looked at the coffin." That night, I walked to the old railway bridge, the one I'd crossed years ago when I ran. The moonlight was pale and cruel. The river below looked exactly as it had that night, a mirror for ghosts. And that's when I saw him. Across the bridge, half hidden in shadow, stood a man. Broad shoulders. A hat tilted low. He didn't move. Didn't speak, just watched me. And even from that distance, I could feel his eyes on me, the same cold weight I'd carried for years. I whispered his name, barely breathing. John. The figure stepped back into the fog and disappeared. My knees buckled. I sank to the ground, sobbing, the truth cracking open inside me. I hadn't escaped. I hadn't buried him. I'd buried the wrong person, or maybe no one at all. And now the dead were writing letters. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window of that narrow room above the laundromat, watching the fog roll in and out of the streetlights like breath from something unseen. Every sound felt like a whisper from the grave, the ticking of the pipes, the shuffle of feet downstairs, the creak of wood as if someone leaned against the door. By morning, my hands were trembling so hard that I spilled coffee all over the table. I kept repeating the same words under my breath. He's dead. He's dead. He's dead. But the more I said them, the less I believed it. I needed to know. I went back to the only place that could tell me the truth, the cemetery. It was in Greenville, a 3-hour bus ride south. I told myself it was foolish, that I'd only find dirt and silence, but the voice inside me, the one that had kept me alive all these years, whispered, "You have to look at the coffin." The cemetery looked smaller than I remembered. The graves were lined unevenly, some sunken, some cracked open by time. I found his headstone at the far edge, where the grass had grown high and unkempt. John W. Carter, 1934 to 1969. Beloved husband. Gone too soon. I knelt down. My fingers brushed the cold stone. For a long while I couldn't move. Then, with a deep breath that tasted like fear, I began to dig. I didn't care who saw me. I used my bare hands at first, then a rusted shovel left behind by a groundskeeper. The earth was heavy, wet, reluctant to let go of its secrets. Hours passed. My palms tore open, but I kept going, because I had to see. And then, the hollow thud of metal, a coffin. The wood was soft, swollen from decades of rain. I pried it open just enough to see inside. My vision blurred. My breath stopped. There were bones, yes, but not his. Too small, too frail. The skull was delicate, like that of a child. I stumbled backward, choking on air. Someone had buried the wrong body. Someone had wanted me to think John was dead. Then I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, behind me. I turned, heart pounding, the shovel trembling in my hands. But there was no one. Only the wind, bending the tall grass, carrying with it the faintest trace of tobacco smoke, the kind John used to roll himself. I ran, I didn't even know where. I just ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. I ended up at a diner by the highway, shaking, covered in dirt. The waitress stared at me like I'd risen from the grave myself. That night, in the motel where I hid, a note slid under the door. Same paper, same typing. You shouldn't have dug, Margaret. There was no signature. But there was something else this time, a Polaroid. Taken from a distance. It showed me kneeling by the grave. I dropped it, trembling. He was alive. Or someone wanted me to believe he was. I looked into the mirror above the dresser and barely recognized the woman staring back, hollow eyes, cracked lips, dirt still under her nails. A ghost of the life she once tried to bury. And then, for the first time in years, I said it out loud, not to the mirror, not to the walls, but to him, wherever he was. I'm not running anymore. The next morning, I packed my things and left town before sunrise. The river was calling me back to where it all began and where it needed to end. The river's edge stretched before me, dark and swollen, as if it remembered every secret I'd ever tried to bury in its depths. The air was thick with the scent of wet mud and rotting leaves, the kind of smell that made your stomach twist and your skin crawl. My hands were raw from digging the cemetery, my body trembling not from cold, but from the sheer weight of fear and anger, and years of silent suffering. Every step toward the water felt like walking into a mirror, reflecting every bruised memory, every whispered prayer, every act of quiet defiance that had kept me alive for decades. I thought I had fled the past, shed Margaret like an old coat, become Clara, invisible, untouchable, but the river reminded me that ghosts do not vanish, they follow, patient, unrelenting. The moon was full, spilling silver light across the black water, and I paused at the railing of the old bridge, gripping it as if it could hold me together when my own resolve wavered. I thought of Samuel and Ruth, children who had once been mine, their small hands clutching mine as if we could shield each other from a world built to hurt me. I thought of Evelyn, who had offered sanctuary, but had carried secrets heavier than the weight of any river. And I thought of John, or the idea of him, the man I had buried in memory only, yet whose presence still loomed, a shadow in every heartbeat. I closed my eyes and let the wind whip across my face, tasting salt, smoke, and something else, something that reminded me of every tear I had ever swallowed. I could almost hear him whispering, telling me I belonged to him, and I shivered not because of fear but because I finally understood that survival was no longer enough. I needed closure. I moved along the bridge slowly, deliberately, every step measured, as if the rhythm of my footfalls could drown out the years of lies and cruelty. The wood groaned beneath me, echoing in the night like a voice calling my name. I lowered my eyes to the water, where moonlight fractured across ripples, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to grieve not for the woman I had left behind, but for the girl who had believed love could save her. That girl had died long ago, and tonight I would bury her properly, beneath the witness of stars and silence. My hand shook as I knelt at the edge, letting the river lap at my bare feet, cold and merciless, and I remembered the night I had faked my death, the fear coiling inside me like a living thing. I had thought that fire and river, a few torn clothes and a scattered shoe, could sever the chains. But here, staring into the same dark water, I realized the chains had never been broken. They had simply slipped into shadows, waiting. I reached into the small satchel at my side, the one I had carried through every town, every bus, every boarding house where I had hidden like a shadow. My fingers closed around the folded letter Evelyn had sent, the one that had begun this impossible journey, and I traced her handwriting with trembling fingertips. I thought of all the women I had met in the years since, the kind strangers, the loud Ruths, the silent Thomases, and how none had known the cost of freedom, the price I had paid in solitude, fear, and stolen breaths. I whispered her name softly, letting it slip into the night, Evelyn, and the river answered with a hiss, a shiver that ran up my spine. I wondered if she knew the depth of her betrayal, if she understood that in protecting me from him, she had also betrayed me to herself. But there was no time for answers now, no time for reflection, only the river and its dark promise. I had to face it, had to see the truth that had always been waiting beneath its surface. The water was colder than I remembered, shocking my legs as I stepped in, toes sinking into the muddy riverbed, the current tugging at my skirts like fingers trying to pull me under. I shivered, not from cold alone, but from the memory of every time I had been cornered, every time John's hand had pressed against my wrist or cheek, every sermon twisted into a rope round my neck. And yet, as the river closed around my ankles, I felt a strange clarity, as if the water could wash away more than just my footprints, could cleanse decades of fear and lies. I let my satchel float a few inches ahead, the locket and letters bobbing lightly, fragile in the moonlight, and I whispered a promise to the woman I had been. The girl I had buried, I will see this through. Hours must have passed as I waded, letting the river guide me, each step a confession, each ripple a remembrance of pain and survival. I imagined Margaret Miller, Margaret Fields, Mary Allen, Clara, all the names I had worn like skins, and I imagined them buried along the banks of this river, faces turned toward the moon, hearts open. And then I felt it, a subtle shift in the current, a whisper in the mist, a shadow that didn't belong to the night. I froze, muscles taut, every nerve screaming. There he was, Or at least, a figure that carried his weight, the same broad shoulders, the same measured stance. The mist curled around him like smoke, and I realized with a jolt that this was not just memory or fear, it was him. Alive, waiting, watching. The air thickened, pressing against my chest, making each breath a labor. The river, once a sanctuary, now felt like a stage, the spotlight on a scene I had hoped never to replay. I gritted my teeth, trembling with rage and fear, and took a step forward, letting the water rise to my knees. "John," I said, voice low, steady, defiant. "Not Margaret, not Clara, not Mary, just me. I'm not running anymore." The mist swirled, carrying my words across the water, and I could almost see him flinch, almost see recognition pass across the sharp lines of his face. The river hissed, frothing at my feet, daring me, challenging me to take the next step, to finish what I had begun years ago, to confront the past once and for all. And in that moment, every scar, every bruise, every stolen breath coalesced into a single, unshakable resolve. I would no longer hide. I would no longer vanish. The years of sacrifice, of careful survival, of hiding in shadows and adopting false names had led me here. Now it was time to reclaim the life I had been denied. Time to force the living and the dead to reckon with the truth. The figure on the far bank didn't move at first, just watched, silent as the river whispered around my knees. The moonlight caught his face in glimpses, the sharp angles I knew so well, and my stomach twisted not fear this time, but recognition, the awful clarity that all those years hadn't erased him. He stepped forward, boots pressing into the mud, and I could see the faint glint of something in his hand, maybe a knife, maybe nothing. I clenched my fists beneath the water, feeling the chill bite into my bones, and I whispered again, my voice trembling but fierce, "John, it ends tonight." For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then he laughed, low and rough, the sound carrying across the river like a curse. "Ends? Margaret, you've always thought you could leave me, didn't you? Even now, you think the past belongs to you." His words were calm, almost amused, but the anger simmered underneath like a coiled snake. I hated the way they still managed to cut through me, even after all these years. "You never left," he said. "You just buried yourself in lies, names, rivers, coffins. And you thought that could hide you from me." He took another step closer, and the water swirled around my knees, tugging at my skirts like it wanted to claim me, like it understood the gravity of this moment. I lifted my chin. "I buried no one but your lies," I said, letting the words ring out, carrying decades of fear, frustration, and finally, defiance. The wind tugged at my hair, whipping it across my face, but I refused to move backward. "I am not your possession anymore. Not your Margaret, not your Clara. I am me. And I am done running." My voice cracked with intensity, trembling with the years of suppressed terror, but I didn't care. The moon shone down like a witness, and I let it illuminate every line of anger, every scar, every memory of the hands that had struck me, the words that had broken me. He stopped, just a few feet away now, the mud squishing beneath his boots. The river between us roared softly, indifferent, patient, like it had been waiting for this confrontation. I could smell the faint mix of tobacco and sweat that clung to him, the scent that had haunted my childhood, my youth, my entire adulthood. "Do you know what you look like to me?" he said, voice low and sharp, a ghost, a shadow. A mistake I'll never forgive myself for missing. His eyes glinted with something I hadn't seen in decades, fear. Not of me, not yet, but of the unknown. And I realized then that the power he had held over me for 20 years existed only in my submission, in my silence. I had given it to him willingly once. No longer. I took a step forward, letting the icy river water lap at my thighs. "I am not your mistake, John. I am not Margaret Fields. I am not Margaret Miller. I am not Mary Allen. I am alive. And I am not yours." The words left my mouth with a weight I hadn't known existed. a liberation so raw it made my chest ache. I saw a flicker in his expression, something like recognition, maybe even disbelief. He opened his mouth, tried to speak, and I interrupted him, voice rising, trembling, commanding, "No. You do not get to touch me. You do not get to haunt me. You are gone. You are nothing now." The river, the mist, the moon, it all seemed to respond to my fury. I felt a surge of power, decades of fear transformed into something almost violent, a storm in my veins that refused to be contained. John stepped back, his eyes narrowing, confusion and rage battling across his face. And I realized, in that suspended moment, that he had spent all these years imagining I would always flee, imagining I would always hide. But here I was, standing, shivering, soaked, staring him down. And I was done. He said nothing more. Just a shallow breath, a grunt of frustration, and then he turned. He didn't run, he didn't vanish, he just walked back into the mist, disappearing slowly, leaving only the echo of his boots and the faint curl of tobacco smoke. The river accepted him, the night accepted him, but I did not. I stayed rooted, knees deep in the cold, trembling not with fear, but with the impossible weight of survival. I had faced him. I had confronted the past. And for the first time, it had no hold over me. I sank to my knees, letting the river water rise around my waist, and I laughed softly at first, then louder, the sound carrying across the black water. It was a laugh of release, of victory, of mourning and joy tangled together, the kind of laugh that leaves you breathless but alive. I reached into the river, letting my fingers trail through the icy current, and whispered to the shadows and the mist, "You are gone. I am free." The wind picked up, tugging at my hair, my soaked clothes, and I let it carry my whispered promise away, over the river, across the land, into the world that had tried to bury me alive. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. I no longer measured time by anything but the beat of my own heart. The moon drifted high, then low, and I finally stepped out of the river, water cascading down my legs, soaking through every layer. My clothes clung, heavy with mud and wetness, but I didn't care. I was alive, fully alive, every nerve ending singing with the strange thrill of unbound life. I found a small rock on the bank, smooth and cool, and pressed it to my chest like a talisman, a symbol, a witness. "No more names," I whispered. "No more hiding. No more fear. Only me." I walked back toward the woods, leaving footprints in the mud that the river would wash away by morning, but I carried every memory inside me, every lesson, every scar, every betrayal transformed into armor. The years of sacrifice, manipulation, the impossible prayers, the lies, the deaths I had faked, the lies I had lived, none of it could touch me now. I was the only constant, the only truth. I would walk away from every river, every coffin, every shadow, carrying only myself. And for the first time, I felt the depth of what it meant to truly be free. I walked through the woods, each step crunching over fallen leaves, the mud of the riverbank giving way to the brittle, dry carpet of the forest floor. My body ached in places I hadn't realized were tense, muscles trembling from cold, exhaustion, and the adrenaline that refused to leave me. Yet each ache was proof of survival, each tremor a reminder that I had endured what others would have thought unbearable. The river receded behind me, its dark surface swallowing the last reflection of the figure who had haunted me, and I realized I didn't look back. Not even once. Margaret Miller, Margaret Fields, Mary Allen, Clara, they were all names I had left behind, fragments of skin I had shed to escape his grasp. And now, in the quiet of the early morning, the world was mine to step into, unclaimed and unshackled. I found a small clearing where the trees arched above like a cathedral. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, and I let myself breathe deeply, letting the scent fill my lungs as though it were absolution. For the first time in decades, I felt unburdened, the years of fear, manipulation, and betrayal melting into something softer, almost sacred. I could feel the pulse of life around me, birds beginning their morning calls, the distant hum of traffic somewhere far beyond these woods, the river whispering secrets I no longer needed to hear. And I understood, with a clarity that startled me, that freedom was not the absence of danger, but the presence of choice. I had chosen me. That was the true miracle. That was the final victory. I thought of Samuel and Ruth, of Evelyn, of Thomas, of every name I had lived under. The faces of the children I had loved and left, of the sister I had trusted and lost, flashed through my mind, and I felt a complex ache, a mixture of sorrow and relief. I had stolen myself back from the hands that would have held me captive forever, but the cost had been immense: isolation, silence, a perpetual vigilance that never truly ended. Yet even in this ache, there was a strange beauty, the reminder that I had endured, that I had navigated impossible circumstances and emerged intact, though scarred. The world had tried to define me, to cage me with names, with lies, with the illusion of death, but I had reclaimed the narrative, and that was a power they could never take. The wind shifted, rustling through the trees and carrying the scent of rain from distant clouds. I realized how long it had been since I had felt this kind of clarity, this raw, unfiltered presence. My fingers touched the small locket I still carried, the gift from Evelyn that had journeyed with me across towns, through years, across rivers and lies. I opened it carefully, revealing the faded photograph inside, a young girl smiling with innocent hope. I whispered to her, to the child I had been, to every iteration of Margaret and Clara, we survived. We're alive. We're finally free. And though tears threatened, I let them fall, not as a sign of weakness, but as acknowledgement of every hurt, every injustice, every night spent trembling in silence. I began walking again, following a narrow path that led away from the river, away from the ghosts, toward the unknown. The morning sun began to creep over the horizon, painting the world in soft golds and pinks, a palette that no painter could truly capture. A light that belonged only to those brave enough to step into it. I didn't know where I would go next, perhaps another town, another house, another name, but it no longer mattered. Each step was mine to take, each breath mine to command. I had spent years listening to the world dictate my story, bending to the will of men and circumstances that sought to define my existence. No longer. The past could linger, shadows could follow, letters could arrive, and memories could haunt, but I had mastered the one thing they could not touch, my own resolve. By midday, I reached the crest of a small hill overlooking the town where the river snaked below. I paused, watching the sunlight glint on the water, the same water that had been my tomb, my test, my salvation. And I laughed quietly, a sound like broken glass and rain, jagged but beautiful, because I knew the truth, the rivers we cross, the lies we bury, the names we leave behind, they are all lessons. The world cannot own us. The past cannot hold us. We only truly exist in the choices we make in the present, in the courage to step forward when fear grips our hearts, and the courage to refuse to run. I straightened my shoulders, feeling the warmth of the sun against my damp skin, the ache of my muscles, the pulse of life coursing through me, and I whispered to the wind, to the river, to the universe itself, I am here. I am alive, and I will remain. I left the river behind, finally, taking each step with intent, letting the morning swallow the shadows of the night. Letting the earth beneath my feet remind me that I belonged to no one but myself. The ghosts I had carried, the lies I had told, the rivers I had crossed, the coffins I had unearthed, they were all now part of the earth, part of the story that no longer defined me. I was more than survival, more than fear, more than names. I was the sum of every choice I had made, every tear I had shed, every brave heartbeat that refused to be silenced. And in that truth, I felt an unparalleled serenity. The past could watch, the dead could whisper, the world could remember my name, but I would live untethered, unclaimed, fully, impossibly free. And so I walked, letting the town fade behind me, the river glimmer in the sunlight, the past dissolve into the mist of memory. With each step, the weight of Margaret, of Clara, of Mary Allen, fell away, leaving only me, raw and whole, a woman finally unbound, finally unbroken, finally alive. Her journey of fear, lies, and survival has come to an end, but the story will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. If this story moved you, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it so more voices of courage can be heard.